This is Fox 11 Forum, a look at issues of concern to Tucson and Nogales, with your host, Bob Lee.
Good morning. This morning we're coming to you from a beautiful spot near Sonoyta, just off State Route 83. Now, it may not have been the Ponderosa, but in its day, the Empire Ranch spanned more than 1,000 square miles, from Happy Valley and the Rincons to the north, south to the Mexican border. Originally a 4-room adobe house, in 1876, Walter Vail and his partners took it over and built it up into a sprawling cattle empire. Today, though, it's falling into disrepair. We're going to talk about the history of the Empire Ranch and about what's being done to restore it. I think you'll find this morning's program fascinating. Stay with us. Welcome back. This morning again we're talking about the Empire Ranch, a piece of Arizona's history. At one time 40,000 head of cattle roamed the area around this facility. Today it's under the control of the Bureau of Land Management. We're going to talk a little about the history. We're going to talk about how this ranch was used in the 50s, and we're going to talk about some efforts to restore it and what it might be used for as we approach the next century. My guest is Steve Boyce. Steve is the vice president of the Empire Ranch Foundation, a group formed not too many years ago to assist the Bureau of Land Management in the restoration of this facility. Steve, thanks for being with us and sharing your memories of this ranch where you grew up.
You're very welcome.
First, before we get into the history, I think we need to talk quickly about the foundation. Exactly what is the foundation?
The foundation is a nonprofit public benefit type 501c3 corporation that is, the purpose is to generate money in the outside funds, grants, and so forth to use to help the BLM restore the Empire Cienega resource area.
Now let's delve into the history. This ranch, as far as we know, was established back in the 1800s at some point?
Yes, sir. Short version is that there's a Mexican family that, and I don't recall his name right now, that had homesteaded out here, and they had dealings with a gentleman named Edward Nye Fish, who was an entrepreneur, merchant, and so forth in Tucson. And Fish ended up buying it from them for some money that they owed him, and then Fish ran into some people in Tucson, Walter Vail, Herbert Hislop, yeah, and they were looking for a ranch. They were from Hislop was from England, Vail was from New Jersey, Nova Scotia in that area, and they were looking for a ranch. So they made a good deal and they bought the ranch with, there was 160 acres at that point in time. They bought it with approximately 3 or 4, maybe 500 cows. They didn't know how many, and so forth.
The original building was kind of a 4-room adobe building, as I understand.
Well, the way that we haven't really gotten it all nailed down with history, but the buildings that are right back over here are what they say are the oldest part of the buildings, which is what Vail and Hislop got. They said they were not completed and were not finished, and so forth. There's a couple other outbuildings that were built at that point in time or about that time.
And so, as you said, it was kind of a really small spread by what it turned into.
Yes,
this was in 1876 when Walter Vail got it.
Walter Vail got it in 1876.
All right, now I understand that within a few years he kind of bought out his partners.
Yeah, he bought out Hislop in 1878, I think it was. There was another guy named John Harvey that came along in between when Hislop got bought out.
He was another Englishman.
He's another Englishman. They called this the English boys outfit for a while and so forth. It had some hilarious upbringings, different pieces. They bought out some different sheep ranchers, and they gradually started building the ranch and got it into to the point in time when it was, you know, 1 million acres or
now, when Walter Vail died, I believe in 1906, it
yes,
had
sir.
grown considerably?
Yes, sir, it had. It got to be, they had somewhere around 30 or 40,000 head of cows. He had grown a lot in other respects off into California and into the Midwest and so forth, and it was real unfortunate because he really was building an empire with lots of different partners at different times. At that
it
point,
truly was an empire at that point.
It was an empire. It got the name, and the name stuck, and it grew from. They got lots of their income from a mining operation they had in the 1880s, called the Total Wreck Mine. They got stories are like $500,000 worth of net assets or net profit out of that, and back then, in that point in time, $500,000 is a lot of money.
Now, this area at that time was very critical in the cattle industry. A lot of people living in Tucson and watching this program from Tucson still don't kind of really understand what this area here in the Santa Ritas and across southern Pima County and into Santa Cruz County is really all about. And this was 40,000 head of cattle really wasn't unusual in the early 1900s.
No, it sure wasn't.
So this area played a rich role in the development of the cattle industry.
Oh, absolutely. Even when Fish had it, before it got into the point of Vales, Fish had a contract with Fort Buchanan and Fort Crittenden, which is no longer down there, and the forts along the border, and they had a contract to supply him with grain. He raised grain up out of Florence and hauled it down here and used this as a place to depot it, kind of to go to the different forts as they needed it. So there's a lot of mercantilism. I mean, there's a house in Tucson that's got Fish's name tied to it.
It's part of the historic district.
Historic district, yeah.
Brings an interesting point. Where did they get supplies in those days, late 1800s, early 1900s?
I'm guessing I wasn't here, but I would guess in the Tucson would be the closest thing.
Now, didn't Bisbee and some of these communities figure big in the area at that time, too?
Bisbee was pretty good sized. Well, not in the, yeah, I guess in the 1880s it started getting pretty good sized, and there was a route that went down through to Bisbee, and some of it came through here, and some of it went, north through where Benson and St. David and stuff are now.
When did the addition of buildings come around? And Vail, was he responsible
Vail
for that?
did quite a bit of it. Vail and Hislop in that area, they started building like this part that's right here. This part with which has the shingle roof on it now is that part was built by him. They don't really know for sure. Some people say yes. Some people say Hislop built it. I mean.
Sometime prior to 1900.
Oh yes, absolutely before 1900, and it was built kind of in the heyday when they had the income from the Total Wreck mine and stuff like that, which was in the early 1880s.
At the peak of the operation, how many ranch hands were there?
I don't, but there was a lot of them. You figure 40,000 head of cattle, you're probably talking
cowboys.
300 or 400 head of cowboys anyway, I'm sure.
So there was a lot of activity in terms of people at this.
A lot of people, a lot of horseback. Everything was wagons and horses back then. They didn't have any cars per se till. I think it was 1904. There's a picture that.
Yeah, we have a picture of a vehicle. Had to have been one of the first ones
It was
here.
in the crawl. Yeah, it was. It was 1904. There's a story that a guy named Hefner used to work for Vales, and Hefner got the picture, and Hefner told the story of the car that got off the train. It was hauled out here on the train, which by then had come through into Tucson and so forth, and got off the train. They came from out of Vale Station, or Pantano as they called it, and they took the route and came by the Under Arthur Ranch, and they came up through the roads, and they ended up at the Empire Ranch. It was a many-day trek over. And when they bought cars back then, when they sold cars, I guess you'd say, they brought a mechanic along with them because nobody knew anything about them. And so this mechanic and the car and so forth came, and they stayed overnight here, and then they headed out, and then there's stories in Hefner's letters about he got stuck in the wash, which is called the Gardner Canyon Wash, and it got stuck there, and a couple cowboys took ropes and pulled him out, and by the time they got it into Bisbee, it was for the president of the mine in Bisbee at that point in time. And by the time it got to Bisbee, it was broke down again, and it was supposed to be in the 4th of July parade in Benson, and the story was they changed the parade route and put the thing behind the band, and it was all downhill so this thing could coast, so that it didn't spoil all of what the local atmosphere wanted to see about this first horseless carriage, as it was called when it came in there.
What was it like in terms of communication at the turn of the century?
Smoke signals, I guess you could call it. That's kind of a...
No telephone.
No telephones that I know of.
No electricity.
No electricity. It was pretty rough. They had the lanterns, they had the...
Now, when communications finally came here, I believe you told me that the telephone actually was here before electric power came into the area?
Well, we had generators. There used to be a generator, Kohler plant, as they called it back then. It was up over in this area. And then back up there, our family had one up by the old barn up there, and it was the same thing. I used to love getting up in the morning and turning the light switch on to be the first one to start the generator up so all the lights would go on and stuff like that. So
well, that was even as late as the 1950s.
Yeah, when I was a little kid. It was in the 50s.
What was it like growing up on a ranch like this in the 50s? We all had our own kind of childhood memories. I'll bet not many of them were like growing up on the Empire Ranch. We'll continue our discussion and talk about ranch life in the 50s when we come back. Stay with us. Welcome back. We were talking about the Empire Ranch, at one time one of the largest cattle ranches in the Southwest. My guest is Steve Boyce, who is the vice president of the Empire Ranch Foundation. And Steve's family owned this ranch. In fact, your family acquired it, I believe, in the 1920?
Yes, sir. 1928, 27, 28 era.
And at that point, it was still a very active cattle ranch.
Oh, it was. That's why we bought it. We owned the Chiricahua Cattle Company. My grandfather and his brothers and so forth were involved in that, and they had a lease on the San Carlos Indian Reservation, which we know now, and they had to have somewhere to go with the cattle because the Department of Interior said, it's time for you to move your cattle, we're going to give it back to the Indians, or whatever their reasoning was back then. So they had to buy ranches, and so the Empire Ranch was one of them. They bought the Arivaca Ranch, the Rail X Ranch, which is down by Patagonia, and the Eureka Ranch, which is out of Wilcox. And then as time gradually progressed over time to get us up to more toward my generation, they sold off pieces and parts to the, as partners in the Chiricahua Cattle Company, died off and so forth, and then we ended up with this ranch and the Arivaca Ranch and the Rail X.
Now, the activity on the ranch, even in the 1930s, was still very much of what people probably picture as being the Wild West. There was cowboys and bunkhouses and all sorts here. It was not downtown Brooklyn.
No, it was not downtown big city. No, it was not.
And the life was still pretty rough.
Yes, it was. It was definitely real rough.
Bunkhouse, cookhouse.
Yes,
and,
lots of which you can see in these buildings here. I mean, that was the kitchen and bunkhouse and so forth.
And we're taping this in July, and life in July was probably pretty hot, and still
pretty hot,
the job had to be done.
Yeah, you didn't have fresh meat. You had jerky and that kind of stuff. Yeah, they didn't have ice boxes per se.
And roundups occurred?
Roundups, well, this time was a little bit late, but they were working the cattle for sure. They'd round up usually, the roundups early in the spring when they'd brand and so forth was when it was cooler, so they didn't have problems with flies and screwworms and that kind of stuff.
Brings us to the 50s. You came along. What was it like at that point, where the rest of the country was kind of discovering Eisenhower, and we'd come out of the Korean War, and rock and roll was discovered? What was happening here?
It was interesting. It was fun. It was like having a playground that's 10 miles as far as you could walk farther from the Whetstone Mountains over here to the Santa Rita Mountains up here, and that was our playground. And that was a place that we learned, and we grew up, and we learned about everything. It's like a jack of all trades, master of none type of thing.
Kids to play with?
Absolutely. All the kids, my sisters, I had sisters, and the different people that were working here had different kids. There was, in fact, one kid's name was Tater, we call him, and there's some interesting names that all of us had. So
there were families that actually, besides the Boyce family, there were other families that were in residence here at that time?
Yes, there were.
And where'd you go to school?
I went to school for the first 5 years at a school. It's non-existent anymore. It's called the Empire School. And it was up the Empire Canyon or Empire Gulch or Big Cienega Gulch or whatever you want to call it, depending on whose name you want to use at what time. I went there for 5 years, and then we moved to town so I could go to a better school, because it was a one-room school. I think a total of 12 people from 1st through 6th grade, so there wasn't much of a chance of interaction with much other people.
No television out here at that time?
No, not when I was a little bitty kid, no.
You had radio?
We had radio. We had, like, the electricity came out here in 57, I think it was. The El Paso Natural Gas Company put the natural gas line through here in 58. And the phone was here. It was one of those hand crank type phones that Grandma was 2 rings, or Grandma was 1 ring, we were 2 rings, and that kind of stuff. So,
did you have a sense in the 50s, you're here in the Empire Ranch, kind of out in the middle of nowhere, did you have a sense of what was going on in the rest of the world with rock and roll coming on the scene, things changing rapidly?
No, not really. That's why going to town was kind of good. It was kind of a shock. I knew how to ride a bicycle. That was one of the good points I had, because they'd push us off the hill up here and says, you're going to learn how to ride. And you kind of wobble along, and you end up going down through the Sackatone and so on. But it was definitely a different thing.
At what point did things begin to change then for you?
When I moved to town.
And that was it?
That was the major part of it. I went to town, went to the Tucson Public Schools, and went to Sam Hughes for 6th grade, and then Mansfield, and then Tucson High. And
what was going on here at the time?
Still basically ranching, you bet. It was a cow-calf operation, running cows and calves and so forth. We had Herefords, and we had a purebred herd of Herefords that came from the XIT Ranch, which my great-grandfather had managed when they dispersed the XIT Ranch in Texas. And we had our own breeding program with this ranch and the Arivaca Ranch and so forth.
Now, there was 40,000 head here at one time when Walter Vail had it. How many head did your family have?
We had probably, well, when they moved off of the San Carlos, they say there was between 30 and 40,000 that came off of there. And gradually over time, like I said, when the partners died in the Chiricahua ranches and that kind of stuff, the numbers dwindled and the land sizes dwindled. I mean, this ranch used to go from Happy Valley up by the Rincons clear to the Canela Mountains or to Mexican border, whichever you call it, and to the Whetstones on this side and the Santa Ritas. Well, now it went from the Empire Mountains, which are way this way compared to Happy Valley, and it goes to the outside of Sonoyta. It was like 50,000 acres at that, or 50,000 acres instead of, you know, 1 million acres as it was in one point in time.
About 20 years ago or so, things began to change a bit for the Empire Ranch, and that brings us to the present day. We'll have an update on what the foundation is doing to try to bring change to the Empire Ranch. Stay with us, we'll be back. Welcome back. We were talking about the Empire Ranch, located, well, originally it was located partly in Pima County and partly in Santa Cruz County. Again, we're about 7 miles north of Sonoyta off State Route 83. My guest is Steve Boyce. Steve is the vice president of the Empire Ranch Foundation. And we kind of took us through the history, Steve, and now we're sort of at the present day. And as we'll see, the foundation that has been formed would like to try to restore some of the buildings here, bring this kind of back to what it was, and provide some sort of additional use for this besides just a grazing area. So why don't you sort of take us through a couple of the rooms here. We'll talk about the rooms, the main room, the great room, the room where the window is added. We want to talk about that and look at some of the buildings. And it looks like with really just a little bit of work, this place could be returned to its glory.
The foundation's purpose is to generate funds for restoring this that are private, from the private sector. We are 501c3 nonprofit, so on, and our purpose is to generate funds. We have a cooperative agreement to work with the Bureau of Land Management in partnership to reestablish some of the historical aspects of things that were here, to rebuild, to preserve, to restore. There's lots of different labels that fit in that whole criteria when you get that whole plan put together, and we're working on that plan at this point in time.
Now, as we'll see as we kind of walk through some of the areas here, the weather has taken its toll certainly on some of the buildings, and we are talking adobe. There's certainly some paint, and then the interior also is in need of some repair. Adobe is sort of unique all its own. I think you were telling me that adobe needs to be lived in?
Yes, sir. Adobe buildings need to be lived in. They grow, they are warm in the wintertime if you keep them warm, they're cool in the summertime if you keep them cool. They need to be lived in, because when you live in something, you maintain it, you take care of it. You know, you water the plants around the outside, or you fix the little cracks that appear as the buildings grow and contract and so forth, as they all do.
Let's talk about the interior. There's some really interesting rooms in this facility. We talked earlier about the bunkhouse and the cookhouse and so forth. As we see, though, lack of use has taken its toll. Let's talk about a room that we saw from the exterior a while ago. It has this nice big window, and this was, I believe you told me at one point, the center of Boyce family recreation and activity?
I would say it, yes, it definitely was. That was the grandma's living room, is what I called it. It has a big Victorian picture window, bay window type of thing in it. Bay window was built early with vails, and then my grandmother rebuilt it or built onto it and made it a little bit different. But it's definitely still the same thing. You look out into a prism of the whole area to the...
The kitchen was kind of interesting also.
Oh yeah, the kitchen we lived in. I mean, between the kitchen and living room, it's mostly the kitchen really, but...
Now there's a building that we want to also talk about, and I believe you told me is one of the earlier buildings. It's an adobe that's located, I believe, somewhat to the east of the property, and that's obviously going to need some work as well.
That needs some serious work. That was a building that Dick and Eva Jimenez lived in. Dick Jimenez is still alive. He and Eva both are alive. They have some of the oral history stuff done with him. And Dick and Eva used to live in it when they worked here for my grandfather, when they were over in that era. Another point that I'd like to bring up at this point is that we are working with oral history tapes of old generations of people and families. We would appreciate any information from any direction we can get from that too, Bob.
All right, and why don't you tell us right now, there's a phone number that people can call to...
I can give you my phone number. I don't have the phone number of the foundation right off the top of my head. I can give you my phone number, and I can get you in touch with the right people doing that. My phone number is in Tucson. It's 889-3451. There's a phone machine on there most of the time, and if there's not, then I'll be back, and please call me back if I don't get there.
All right. Now, the BLM, to their credit, does have the AmeriCorps group out here periodically. There are some kids that come out here from all over the country, basically, and do some work here and are making some efforts. I believe they put a roof on the place,
Yes, sir.
on the main building, and have done some work on the adobe. And as we're doing this program today, they're also out here doing some work. So there is some activity going on. But as we wrap the program up, from the Foundation's point of view, Steve, where do you see all of this heading, say, 5 years from now?
I would love to see a comprehensive plan completed. I'd like to still keep the partnerships with the BLM, with the different youth programs, whether it's AmeriCorps, Youth at Risk, the kids from like Project More in Tucson. They've got the storefront outfit through Parks and Recreation in Tucson, and just keep it alive, because it's the kids that bring the aliveness too. It's like the reunion was out here a while back from the Vail family. The Vail family was the people that we got our ranch from in the 20s, and they had a reunion. There was 200 to 250 people that descended on Tucson and showed up out here for a Saturday night, and they had a big barbecue and rode horses, and we had wagons, and tried to bring back some of that life and that aliveness. And that's the part we really need, is the aliveness and the heart that this ranch is starting to have it fall apart.
As far as the public is concerned, there might even be some opportunity for the public to enjoy the refurbished Empire Ranch, possibly as a bed and breakfast.
Right now we're in the planning stages, and we really don't have a set-in concrete type of plan. They've done some historic structures reports, they've done lots of different little pieces, but it's there's no overall picture. This is what it's going to be, and this is the direction everybody agrees that we're going to go.
Steve, thanks for being with us this morning.
You're welcome.
We've been talking with Steve Boyce, the Vice President of the Empire Ranch Foundation, talking about its efforts to restore what was one of the premier cattle ranches in this part of the country. And again, if you have any kind of oral history or any pictures or anything that you might like to share with the foundation, here is the number to call and hook up with Steve and get involved with the restoration effort of the Empire Ranch. Next week, back to civilization. We'll be talking about 8/8 crime and its efforts to catch the bad guys. Be with us then. I'm Bob Lee. Have a great Sunday.